Hello chess friends! Today I have for you an insane game from the final round of the Tata Steel's Master Tournament in which Magnus Carlsen brilliantly cracks open Arjun Erigaisi's seemingly impenetrable position with a brutal piece sacrifice leading to a very complex and imbalanced position. Erigaisi bravely defends, but in the end is simply no match for the blinding accuracy with which Carlsen executes his attack, culminating in a beautiful forced mate. This is not a game you want to miss. And without further delay, here it is. Erigaisi, playing white, begins the game with knight to f3. Magnus Carlsen plays knight f6, g3, and we get an opening where both sides wait on committing their central pawns, instead fianchettoing their bishops. Bishop g2 from Erigaisi and bishop b7 from Carlsen. After which we have the light squared bishops on the same diagonal, meaning there's the potential for the bishop trade if this knight were to move. But Erigaisi wants to avoid that, since in this situation such a trade would favor black, leaving white with these weak light squares on the king side where he would like to castle. So Erigaisi is going to want to leave that knight where it is, as long as there's the potential for the bishop trade. Here he castles, and now g6 from Carlsen, going for the double bishop fianchetto. Erigaisi plays c4. He wants to play d4, and then if c5 is played, he can push to d5. That pawn will be defended by a pawn. Of course, Carlsen can play c5 right away, which is a good move, but maybe he doesn't want that much symmetry and instead goes for bishop g7. Now we have d4, castles, and an interesting move, d5 from Erigaisi. Sometimes when you have the pawn duo in the center, it's not good to push the pawn too early. They have more dynamic potential when they're side by side, but in this case, there is some advantage to it because it shuts down this diagonal. The bishop trade isn't going to happen. It opens up the d4 square for the knight. So it's not a bad move. Knight a6 from Carlsen, looking to jump to c5. We get knight c3, knight c5. Erigaisi could kick the knight off that square immediately with b4, but it can just jump to e4. So first he plays knight d4, opening up the bishop so that knight to e4 is not possible, since it will lose a piece. Now he is threatening to play b4, and the knight will just have to go backwards. And now Carlsen has an interesting move, e5, attacking the knight on d4. And this move only works for black because the bishop on b7 is defended, which means if white takes en passant on e6, black is free to capture with the d-pawn and will not lose bishop, which is important because you wouldn't want to take on g2 here because white has the in-between move, e takes f7 with check, and will therefore come out a pawn ahead. However, Erigaisi does not take us down this road. He does not capture en passant, and instead moves the knight back to c2. Which isn't bad. The engine liked knight b3 a little better to challenge this knight right away. Carlsen plays a5, securing his knight's post on c5 so that if b4 is played, the pawn will just capture. And now we have this move b3, which is a top engine move. I guess it's a bit of a waiting move, and it anticipates this maneuver knight e8 to d6, which would come with a tempo on the c-pawn if it wasn't defended. That's what the engine likes, redeploying the knight to d6 and then playing f5. But Carlsen opts for d6 instead, defending his e5 pawn and preventing any possible d6 in the future with some kind of discovery on his b7 bishop. White might find a way to make that advantageous later on. And since this d-pawn's now fixed, this bishop has become what we call a bad bishop, just staring at its own pawn. And it becomes even worse after Erigaisi's next move, e4. Not many diagonals available for this bishop anymore, with all these white central pawns. But Erigaisi's trying to create a super strong closed structure, which Carlsen's going to have to find a way to crack open if he wants his own bishops to have any activity. So sometimes if you can keep the structure closed, you can get away with having an inactive bishop, because none of the bishops are really doing much. You need the position to open up and pawns to come off the board so that they have free open diagonals. So Carlsen, immediately realizing that there will always be a pawn on d5, since it has so much support from other pawns, he redeploys the bishop to c8. Knowing that this diagonal offers him nothing, knight to a3 from Erigaisi, it's a good move. He's going to b5, he wants to target the c7 pawn, which is a bit weak. And now knight to e8. Not a lot of pawn breaks left in this position, so this clears the way for f5. We got knight a to b5, and now bishop to d7. We got rook b1 from Erigaisi. He wants to play a3 and b4 relatively soon. Doesn't want that rook on a vulnerable file if there's a pawn capture on b4. And it also protects the pawn when it lands on b4. Okay, so here we go, f5 from Carlsen. And Erigaisi plays a natural looking move. He plays f3, which is a common thing to do when you're anticipating a move like f4, when you want to block that pawn from moving even further. You don't want it coming to f3. But that wasn't really necessary right away because the bishop and the queen have control of that square. So it might have been a little stronger to wait on playing this move. Might not be the most flexible option. But okay, we got f4, now a3, preparing b4, and Carlsen plays g5, continuing to gain space on the king side. He doesn't mind his knight being kicked off c5. But perhaps the strongest move was a4. Now if you play b4, the knight can jump to b3, defended by the pawn. And this does sacrifice a pawn after b takes a4, but the knight gets to maintain its post on c5, and there will be continuous pressure on this horribly weak a pawn. So with the two doubled isolated pawns on this open a file, the extra pawn is not worth all that much. So maybe that was best, but we have g5, b4, kicking the knight, knight b7. And now Erigaisi decides to close up the structure even further with g4. So it seems that his strategy now is to try to just keep everything closed up with an impenetrable blockade, and maybe the game will go into a no progress situation and it will just peter out to a draw. But Carlsen has other plans. He plays h5 right away, threatening to win a pawn on g4. White can win this pawn momentarily, but will not be able to hang on to it. Knight f6 will be played. That pawn will be picked up. So instead we have h3, supporting the g4 pawn. And how to make progress here is black. Well, Carlsen's about to show us. He plays rook to f7, planning bishop f8, rook h7, and then he can open this file when he wants, and the rook will have an open file to work with. Erigaisi, anticipating that plan, says, I'm getting my king away from that side of the board. And now there's a move that looked a bit odd to me at first glance, rook to g1. But the purpose of this is to make possible the move bishop f1, and then redeploy the bishop out this direction, where it will still be a bad bishop, but maybe there's some future hope of activity. Maybe someday c5 could be played or something. This plan would not be as feasible if you had played rook h1 instead, because there'd be rook h7. Now if you move the bishop to f1, there's h takes g4, and you cannot recapture with the h-pawn or you're losing your rook. So you'd have to recapture with the f-pawn, but then black has this nice passed pawn. This is not what Erigaisi wants. Well, this is why we see rook to g1. Okay, rook h7 as planned, bishop f1, knight f6, just improving the knight, king to e1. Erigaisi realizes that with most of black's pieces pointed towards this side of the board, his king is going to be safest over here. Sure, black can open up this file and the rook has activity on this file here, but none of the other pieces can really support a very effective attack on the queen side at the moment. The king side is where everything's happening. So he says, I'm getting my king away from that area. Queen to c8 played, which should be a clue as to how Carlsen is planning to crack open this position. Rook b2 from Erigaisi. The rook's a little more active. It's watching the h2 square. In case there's a pawn exchange, the rook cannot penetrate the position with rook to h2. Now we got knight d8. That knight's going to f7. Generally a good idea to move as many of your forces into the area in which you want to attack, even if you're not sure exactly how it's going to go down. And at this point we have a very natural looking move from Erigaisi, queen to d3, which the computer says is a mistake. Though the reason why it's a mistake requires us to examine a complex computer line, which I'll just show you briefly. Apparently queen b3 is what needed to be played so that b4 has more protection. I'll show you the relevant variation. H takes g4, h takes g4, a takes b4, a takes b4. And then black plays c6. We got d takes c6, knight takes c6. And now black is threatening to penetrate with rook a1. That's not good for white, but also has a less obvious threat, which can be executed if, let's say, rook b1 stopping rook a1, knight takes b4, which would not be working for black if the queen was on b3. You could just take with the queen, but taking with the rook runs into queen c5, hitting both rooks. So that's why the computer does not like queen d3. It thinks you should have played queen to b3 instead. But Carlsen does not execute that variation, which was the strongest way to play. Instead, he goes for knight to f7. And Erigaisi's king continues to move towards the queen side. Bishop e7, improving the bishop. King c2, maybe the king will tuck himself away on b1. But now it's time to break things open. A takes b4, a takes b4, h takes g4, h takes g4. Now the engine still likes c6 here, but Carlsen goes for rook to a1. Erigaisi challenges the rook right away with rook to b1. We got rook h2 check. Looks a bit scary, but that check can be blocked in a few different ways. The best way to block it, which Erigaisi did not play, was bishop to e2. So the bishop and the rook are participating. Although the bishop is pinned, this rook is under attack. So after rook takes b1, which is black's best move, king takes b1, the bishop is no longer pinned to the king, and we got two pieces defending g4. Now let's contrast that to what happened in the game. Rook to g2. This allows rook takes g2 check, bishop takes g2, and now g4 is only defended by a pawn, meaning that Carlsen can take on b1, and after king takes, Carlsen has his opportunity to crack open this position with knight takes g4, f takes g4, bishop takes g4. Two pawns for the sacrificed piece, and oh, what pawns they are. Two connected passers who can protect each other as they march forward. This is very dangerous for white. Although the engine thinks that white should be able to hold this. We have bishop to f3. Carlsen avoids the exchange of bishops. He plays bishop to h3. Now there's no good way to stop g4. So Erigaisi plays bishop to h5 so that the bishop will be a little more active, so that after Erigaisi's next move g4, the bishop does not have to go backwards. Erigaisi plays knight to e2. He needs to get his pieces to this side of the board now. Got to try to stop these pawns any way he can. Bishop to f1, pinning the knight to the queen so that f3 is a threat, since it will win the knight. So queen d1 with a counterattack on the bishop. Bishop goes to g2. Now bishop g6. Looking to post up on f5 with an attack on the queen. Knight g5 from Carlsen. Attacking the e-pawn now with two pieces. Knight b to c3 defends. Now bishop to f3, again pinning the knight and clearing the way for this g-pawn. And here Erigaisi makes what turns out to be his fatal error. He puts his queen in front of the passed pawns, which is the right idea, but he put her in front of the wrong pawn. He probably knows that at some point he's going to have to sacrifice one of his pieces to get two of these pawns. But he chooses the wrong two. What ends up happening is knight takes f4, the pawn takes, and he wins these two pawns, leaving Carlsen this passed g-pawn. What he needed to play was bishop f5 first, according to the computer, queen moves, and then queen g1. That way if g3's played, he has the potential to take on g3 with the knight, and after the pawn recaptures, and he takes on g3, again, he's won these two pawns instead. Black will have no more passed pawns, and white will be okay. And black doesn't have a real convenient way to add more protection to g3 to try to avoid this. For example, queen h5, you go bishop d2, queen h4, defending g3, you got bishop to e1. So apparently this is how white holds the position. But let's contrast to what was played in the game, queen to f1, king g7 from Carlsen, clearing the way for his next move. After bishop to f5, the queen's able to go to h8. And now we have knight takes f4, giving back the piece for the two pawns. But this was not even the most accurate move at this point. It seems that queen d1 would have offered white the best hope, although probably still losing. After g3, at least you can go to a4 and try to get some counterplay. After a line like this, g2, the knight blocks the pawn, queen h1, the queen can infiltrate, attacking the bishop. This is what the computer thinks is the best hope. A very complicated line which obviously I do not have the time here to do justice to. But what we have is knight takes f4, grabbing the two pawns, giving the piece back, bishop takes f4. After which queen to h4 is the most crushing move apparently, but Carlsen plays bishop to f6, attacking the knight on c3 instead, which gives Erigaisi the chance to set up some counterplay with queen to e1, defending the knight and supporting e5, which again probably does not save his game, but offers him the best chances. Instead, he played queen to c1 with an attack on the knight, while defending the c3 knight. Looks logical, but after knight to f7, e5 is shut down, that square being controlled by two black pieces, and the black queen is again threatening to infiltrate on the h-file, or if white were to try to take measures against that, there's always the a-file too. In some lines, that's working for black. So Erigaisi plays knight to b5, not a bad move, hitting the c-pawn, and more importantly, allowing the queen to go to a3 defended by the knight, after Carlsen's next move, queen to a8, which threatens a forced mate beginning with queen to a1 check. But Erigaisi did not play the queen to a3, and I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe he just took a look at this endgame after queen takes, knight takes, and realized it was completely hopeless. Since this pawn is so far advanced, all black's pieces are over here to help it, and the white king is way over here. This is a losing endgame for white. But what happened in the game isn't any better for white. Instead of blocking this file with the queen, Erigaisi decides to block the diagonal instead. sacrificing a pawn. Now black has 2 passed pawns. However, the queens are still on the board. And practically speaking, maybe it offers white the best hope of finding some trick. Okay, so the bishop's hit. We got bishop d2, knight d6, attacking the bishop, bishop h6 check, king goes to f7, and then he takes the knight on d6. So he takes d6, and now bishop g5. Desperately hoping for bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, when white would actually be winning due to the queen and bishop's activity on these horribly weak light squares. But Carlsen is not going to fall into that. He just plays queen to h8, supporting his bishop and preparing to possibly infiltrate and support the advance of his pawn. Very natural. Bishop to e3, attacks the b pawn, which Carlsen does nothing about. He just plays e4. He knows he can give up that pawn because what he's got going on over here on the king side is coming much too quickly. Bishop takes b6 is played. Now queen to h2. This pawn is just too fast. All of these squares are protected. We got bishop g1, which looks like a good move on the surface. Comes with an attack on the queen, gets in front of the pawn, gets out of the way of this passed pawn. But now we have a very beautiful finish from Carlsen, beginning with the move queen to e2. Looking to come to d3 with check, which Erigaisi does nothing to prevent. Apparently he does not see the danger and just pushes his pawn with b5. But after queen d3 check, he realizes that it's time to throw in the towel, and he resigns. Because what we have is a forced mate in 8 moves. If the game were to continue, there would be king to a2, and now for the killer move, bishop to d1. And there is no good defense to queen to b3 checkmate. You can throw in a check, bishop e6 check, king goes to g7, and now the king's not going anywhere. All of his squares are covered, so you have to do something to keep the black queen off of b3. If you play queen to a3, there's queen c2 check, after which your only legal move is queen to b2, followed by queen takes b2 checkmate. So if you want to prolong the game as long as possible, it's mate in 7 from this point. You got to sacrifice your queen. After bishop takes b2, king takes b2, queen b3 check, but now you got a1. But after bishop c2, there's no defense against queen to b1 checkmate. You can prolong the game for a few more moves with bishop d4 check, king moves out of danger, bishop g7 check, king takes g7, and now it doesn't matter what move you make, since queen to b1 checkmate is next. So another very impressive and accurate conversion by Magnus Carlsen, making very few less than perfect moves and keeping the pressure on, anticipating that in such a complex position, with such dangerous passed pawns for black, Erigaisi would most likely slip up, since he had such a narrow path that offered him any hope of survival. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe to the channel for more videos like this coming your way soon. See you next time.